last lecture. This 10 days that I've been here have just flown by, and so I want to thank James and Phil again for inviting me, and of course Deborah, Tony, and Becca for all they've done in organizing this. I think you've really got a great formula going. Get a group of interesting and interested people, put them in a gorgeous location, feed them lots of good Italian food and some wine, stir gently, and see what happens. It's been a really wonderful time, and I really appreciated hearing all the talks by the other professors and associates, and just am continually surprised at how they were speaking to one another without really even trying, and how people then made an effort to go back and rethink their thoughts. I mean, I really feel in the presence of emerging knowledge, and so my final talk too is indebted to many of the talks that have gone before. Most specifically, as you'll see from the topic, to Judy's talk yesterday, and to Piotr's also. Specifically at the end of Piotr's talk, he talked a little bit about vulnerability, and so I can say this is very fresh research. I haven't presented this before, so anyway, I hope it makes sense. It has become a largely, well, let me start here. Before I go into that, I just wanted to share with you a quotation I found by Susan Bassnett talking about what I intended with the idea of translation literacy. She said, "What I would like to see is translation being taught in programs across the board, integrated into studies of all kinds, including medicine, law, business, the sciences, and not just within the humanities, or as an add-on to foreign language learning. And I would like to see people who consider themselves translation studies experts explaining to the rest of the world exactly what they think their subject is." So again, to bring us full circle here with this idea of promoting a broad-based translation literacy, and what we're doing is not just for translators anymore. And I borrowed this quotation from Judy's talk because I thought it would set up my discussion today very well. I love this quote: "Serious problems do arise when one fails to examine, among other issues, the constructed nature of one's starting point." And of course, when you write histories, they almost invariably have an origin, right? And I'm going to ask us to critically examine that origin we often circulate about translation studies. All right? Because the problem here is, by producing and reproducing a very restrictive history of the field that solidifies, I think, Western hegemony, despite calls for enlarging translation studies or for critiquing the Eurocentric bias of our concepts and models, undercuts the whole attempt to enlarge the field, right? And this history has surprisingly been left untouched, uncritically examined by theorists. So what I hope to do today is kind of deconstruct, to help us unlearn, provincialize this Western history so as to make way for alternative conceptualizations of translations and translators to emerge. So it has become a largely unquestioned truth in translation studies that the field arose in the West following the Allied victory in the Second World War, a period often associated with the universalization of Western values and institutions as enshrined in the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Man, as Joseph Slaughter argues in Human Rights, Inc. I put Western in quotation marks here, as the recently post-World War II vanquished nations of Germany and Italy can hardly be considered on the periphery of Western culture, but their fascist past was relegated in the post-war period to the margins of the post-war Western imaginary. I will refer to this narrative as the originary myth of translation studies, using myth deliberately to indicate that the power and authority of this narrative, as I will attempt to demonstrate below, is derived not from primary sources or logical argumentation. It is in fact supported, surprisingly, by little concrete evidence and by a general ignorance of non-Western traditions. Its value is derived from its recitation, its continued iteration by authoritative figures in the field, in a process that Barbara Smith calls value begetting value, right? She talks about this in her wonderful book, Contingencies of Value, about anthologies. And I'm going to be talking about our anthologies in a few minutes, right? And with this reiteration, we naturalize the myth and endow it with an air of common sense. In other words, this historical narrative is not put forward as an interpretation to be defended, but is typically presented as a self-evident fact. Like Homi Bhabha's myth, originary myth of colonialist power, this narrative reflects, quote, the demand that the space it occupies be unbounded, its reality coincident with the emergence of the imperial narrative and history, its discourse non-dialogic, its enunciation unitary, unmarked by difference. The only revision I would make here is to replace the traditional understanding of empire here with capital E, empire, as theorized by Hart and Negri in their book, Empire. They situate the definitive emergence of a new supranatural global order at roughly the same time and place as Western translation scholars situate the emergence of translation studies. As they write, the birth of the United Nations at the end of the Second World War merely reinitiated, consolidated, and extended this developing international juridical order that was first European but progressively became completely global. So by replacing small e empire with capital E empire, I'm begging the question of how this originary myth of translation studies relates to that new global order. I think these are really pressing questions for us because we've been ignoring how we situate ourselves vis-a-vis the growing hegemony of English, of the global language. Right? So how does it relate to the new global order, or to quote the capitalist project to bring together economic power and political power to realize, in other words, a properly capitalist order? And those are Negri and Hart's words. So how is the myth of translation studies implicated in the rise of empire? Does it work to mystify the workings of that new capitalist world order, specifically the hegemonic spread of Western values and languages at the expense of minor ones, and through the promotion of transposability over translatability? As Brian Lennon suggested when he claimed that translation today is, quote, easily conflated with globalization as the play of free or autonomous, non-social or inhuman market forces. Now, these questions largely fall outside the scope of this paper, but I just want to suggest today that we cannot even begin to answer those questions. That is, to interrogate the relationship of translation studies, capital T, capital S, to empire, capital E, or to the rise of the neoliberal order, until we acknowledge that the currently circulating narrative of the origins of translation studies is not a self-evident fact, but a mythic construct. An example of what Dennis Tedlock, the translator of the Mayan sacred text Popol Vuh, calls a mythistory, the function of which is not to shore up what Westerners define as historical truth, but to supply a foundational narrative that helps a group of people form a collective identity. But notice here, he seems to notice a divide in pre-modern cultures have mythistory and we have history. But so what I'm going to suggest is no, we also have these mythistories, and our story of the emergence of translation studies in the victorious West after World War II is one such mythistory. Also, like myth, this narrative has remarkable staying power, despite repeated calls to enlarge translation studies and move the field beyond Eurocentric interests and presuppositions, Maria Timoshko's words. In a 2011 special issue of the journal Translation and Interpreting Studies, dedicated to the topic of Eurocentrism, for example, Maria Timoshko writes, discourses about Eurocentrism are one tool being used to decenter the field, to open up translation theory to broader perspectives, to enlarge exemplification, and to break the boundaries constraining the epistemology of translation studies as it has developed within the implicit European continentalization that has characterized the field for most of its history. So Tymoshko's act of decentering the field is, however, predicated on its initial unproblematic centering in the post-war West, a gesture that perversely reinforces the originary myth of translation studies by conflating the Western tradition with the field and positing non-Western perspectives as secondary critiques or add-ons. To avoid the hierarchy of primariness and secondariness, we must, I would suggest, begin by critically examining this initial process of centering, that is, by deconstructing the Western originary myth of translation studies. For by situating the birth of translation studies in the triumphant post-World War II West, scholars in the field may be exercising what Victor Mignolo describes, and this is key to my project here, the West's epistemic privilege of narrating its own local history and projecting it onto universal history. So until this narrative is provincialized a la Chakrabarty, any attempts to enlarge translation studies, I would argue, can only be an expansion. To put this metaphorically, Gregory Shreve described translation studies in the inaugural volume of the Kent State University Press's scholarly monograph series in translation studies as, quote, a house with many rooms. But until we can deconstruct the originary myth of translation studies, no matter how many rooms we add, it will remain the house that the West built. Another way to think of this was offered by Piotr yesterday, the difference between understanding the emergence of the field as a tree, where that trunk is the Western translation studies and all the other traditions can only be branches that come off of it, or to think in terms of the rhizome, right, where we can allow for many histories to arrive with different, perhaps, etymologies. And I think the need to deconstruct this myth is all the more urgent as scholars in other fields, now thanks to the translational turn, have begun to incorporate this translation studies perspectives into their work, and in doing so contribute to the unquestioned iteration of the myth, or rather to the production of this narrative as myth. Brian Lennon in Babel's Shadow, for example, quotes Bassnett situating the birth of the field with James Holmes' Adamic act of naming it in his The Name and Nature of Translation Studies, a version more recently reiterated by Mark Polizzotti in his 2018 Sympathy for the Translator. Note, in both cases, this history is cited in unflattering ways. First, to associate translation with the worst forces of globalization, and second, to suggest the utter irrelevance of the field to working translators, right? So again, this is one of the pressures on us as translation studies, or an interest in translation studies, spreads to other fields. Unfortunately, so too has this myth, and often it has been used against us, and perhaps rightly. So we have an investment, I think, in critically examining the investments we've had in telling this particular story of the birth of translation studies. So below, I will outline the features of this Western narrative that qualify it as mythistory, then raise the possibility of imagining other histories of the field, and end by demonstrating how delineating multiple histories and points of origin to create a polycentric history rather than an alternative one can enrich our understanding not only of translation studies outside the West, but of Western translation studies too. Now, I should note that the scholars I'm going to quote, I have enormous respect for their work. Their work is typically characterized by an enormous amount of integrity and scholarly finesse. But with this myth you see them doing what I can only call bad history. And I want to take a look at what constitutes this as bad history. And I should note that perhaps the clearest evidence that we are dealing with mythic thinking is that when dealing with other topics, these scholars are for the most part quite excellent, responsible cultural historians. Now there are, I think, 4 specific ways in which this originary story reveals itself to be bad history, reflecting the West, to use Mignolo's term, epistemic privilege of narrating its own local history and projecting it onto universal history. Number 1, the narrative is characterized by universalizing pretensions. So let's begin with the first conscious history of the field, provided, again, appropriately enough, by James Holmes, who is said to have founded the modern field of translation studies with his classic essay, The Name and Nature of Translation Studies. As Holmes writes, after centuries of incidental and desultory attention from a scattering of authors, philologians, and literary scholars, plus here and there a theologian or an idiosyncratic linguist, the subject of translation has enjoyed a marked and constant increase in interest on the part of scholars in recent years, with the Second World War as a kind of turning point. This is the crux of the narrative that gets repeated again and again. Note that Holmes's history lacks any geographic limitations, right? So he doesn't say in the West, he leaves it very open, which I think leaves it open to universalization, as you'll see. Holmes's version is repeated almost verbatim by Raymond Vanderbroek in an article dedicated to Holmes and the birth of the discipline, again, without restricting the story geographically. Quote, up to the middle of the 20th century, the subject of translation had received incidental and desultory attention, the same adjectives, in fact, from authors, literary scholars, theologians, philosophers, linguists, and of course from translators themselves. In Bassnett's 2014 version, she mentions this narrative twice. The first time without geographic limits. Arguably, the point at which systematic investigation into the processes of translation started was during the Second World War. But then she reiterates it and provides and makes this universalizing gesture. James Holmes was indeed perceptive to highlight the Second World War as a turning point in the study and practice of translation around the world. Maria Tomoshko offers perhaps the most extended version of this history in chapter 1.2 of her enlarging translation, Empowering Translators, entitled Periodization and Translation History, which owes much to George Steiner's version of the field. Tomoshko's history is interesting in that she makes repeated attempts to resist universalizing the narrative by occasionally inserting Western in parentheses, which is not surprising given her stated goal of enlarging the field. In the end, however, she is unable to resist universalizing certain aspects of her narrative, specifically the experience of World War II. Tomoshko argues that a variety of factors combined to give birth to the systematic study of translation and interpreting related phenomena in the West in the early post-war period. During World War II, these approaches to language, cultural production, and social manipulation became generalized throughout the world. And later, the war transformed intellectual life worldwide. Her insistence on universalizing the experience of war is based on the argument that, quote, the war had a global scale and reached into normally isolated areas. The claim that all countries of the world experienced World War II in a similar way and derived similar lessons from their wartime experience, I think, is a highly dubious one. Despite repeated attempts to localize her claims, as I said, by inserting Western in parentheses before translation studies or thinking about translation, Tomoshko cannot, in the end, resist claiming the field of translation studies for the West. Quote, in essence, without labeling it as such, Steiner gives us a periodization in which Western thinking about translation is implicitly divided by the post-positivist revolution, confirming the post-war era as the period in which the modern discipline of translation studies was established. All right, so we see the universalizing tendency that everyone experienced the Second World War in the same way, and this gave birth to translation studies. The second feature that makes this story a myth, in my opinion, is that it reflects a profoundly developmental logic. In Provincializing Europe, Dipesh Chakrabarty describes the Western historical imagination, or historicism, as characterized by a progressivist bias or developmental logic closely related to the Enlightenment concept of Bildung, right, or formation, education. According to this model, the Western modernity is the end goal of development for the rest of the world. Now, I've argued in the past that Eastern Europe and Russia, as Europe's internal other, provide a good critical vantage point to deconstruct this developmental model and the opposition of East to West. As Reyes has been saying, you know, when people talk about Europe, they assume that it's this, they reify it as this simplistic whole, when in fact, there is a developmental logic within Europe as well, right? Europe is not a unitary thing. And so I think it's important when we have, especially to support interventions from outside the West, that we don't reify some distinction East-West, right? But that within the West too, they had created this developmental mapping. And in fact, Larry Wolff, in his excellent book, Inventing Eastern Europe, contends that the Enlightenment created Eastern Europe as the first example of a developmental history, right? So many of the colonies, in fact, were not seen in a developmental light because they were seen as other. They weren't developing toward the West. Eastern Europe, however, was an image of our past, and it will develop. And this thinking still goes on. We see Eastern Europe described as the old Europe, as the new Europe, etc. So it's hard to get ourselves out of this thinking, this model of thinking about history. And of course, it was reiterated in the post-communist period when that period was described famously as a transition. In any case, we see this developmental logic already alluded to in Holmes's phrase, the marked and constant increase in interest in translation, which coincides rather neatly with the marked and constant increase in the global influence of the West and in the global hegemony of English following the Second World War, all related to the consolidation of empire with a capital E. This developmental logic is evident too in Basnet's chapter devoted to the history of the field, which opens with the subheadings Beginnings and ends with a section entitled The Origins and Development of Translation Studies, right? Clearly referencing this Western progressivist model of history. Tomoshko too resorts to the language of development when she refers to World War II as marking, quote, the ascendancy of post-positivist approaches with academe and for a major epistemological shift in much of the world. Tomoshko's developmental thinking is, however, more evident in the overarching story she tells of the field, which is narrated as a progressivist movement away from the conceptual confines of positivism to the freedom of post-positivism, understood as empowering, right? This narrative is built on a Hegelian conception of the historical process as a movement toward increasing freedom. This, of course, is how Kant imagined Bildung as this maturation, but that was revealed in the end in this freedom of personality. We see this developmental logic too in Venuti's framing of the translator as an oppressed and marginalized minority who must progress from invisibility or darkness to visibility or light. This is a classic Enlightenment narrative, right? They don't call it Enlightenment for nothing. This developmental logic, and specifically the logic of Bildung, is even more evident in Anthony Pym's version of the mythistory of translation studies, which he offers in his Translation Theories Explained. There he provides a similar dating of the emergence of translation studies, beginning with Western theorizing on the nature of equivalence in the 1950s, proceeding through a rejection, again, of the confining notion of equivalence and culminating in the consolidation of translation studies as a field in independent academic departments, brought about, in his interpretation, by the advent of descriptive translation studies in the 1980s. And then his typically charged language, right, that changed everything. If equivalence was suddenly everywhere in translations, or almost, it could no longer be used to support any linguistics that would help create it. The theorizing of translation was thus moved into a realm that was relatively unprotected by any parent discipline. Right here, this is the language of Bildung. It had to found its own discipline, right? So this birth of the field. Elsewhere, Pym writes, translation studies started to take shape as an academic discipline. This history is extremely important. The importance that Pym, the then president of the European Society of Translators, ascribed to that history is linked to his deep investment in the consolidation of translation studies, capital T, capital S, as an independent field. The value of Pym's iteration of the originary myth of the field, while no less Eurocentric than the others, indeed in some ways more so, lies in the fact that it is easily quantifiable, right? So while the question of what constitutes a field of study, and that's why I don't propose to offer an alternative history, because we need to ask the question of what do we mean by field? Is it important that we have a field? In any case, the whole question of what constitutes a field of study, when do we know that it has been born, is left largely unaddressed in the other versions. One can count the number of translation studies departments in existence, right, giving Pym at least this quantifiable number. Is the birth of a field determined by the presence of a certain seriousness, as Holmes suggested, or systematicity of thinking, as Bassnett did, which is not always easy to define, or is it determined by a certain volume of research, then how much suddenly qualifies it as a discipline? Right? If so, what number of books or articles would mark the threshold? So while Pym's idea that we cannot have a field of study without autonomous departments is no less of an interpretive position than the others, it is perhaps a more quantifiable one. But is there any evidence that the research conducted on translation and interpreting related phenomenon outside autonomous departments of translation studies is somehow of less value than the research produced within those departments? Judy suggested yesterday that that is not true. And the great figures of Soviet translation studies, such as Yuri Levin, Andrei Fyodorov, Efim Etkin, to name but a few, worked for the most part in departments of philology and foreign languages. Not surprisingly, perhaps, Pym's choice of departments of translation studies as his index reinforces Europe's leading position in the field. Third, this history of translation studies reinforces a specific reading of Europe. Or to put it otherwise, it maps a specific version of the West. Now, this is evident in Marilyn Gaddis Rose's origin myth, which is characterized by a striking degree of specificity. She declares a 1947 essay by the Bible translator Eugene Nida to mark the precise birth of the field. Quote, although experienced translators must have been trying to explain or justify what they do long before Cicero and St. Jerome, I give notice that in my idiosyncratic American amalgamation, I date the beginning of modern translation studies with Eugene A. Nida's 1947 essay on translation principles, published by coincidence when machine translation was getting started. I note that Wolfram Wils and Georges Moulin also give Nida's essay prominence. So it's always a quoting of other people who've put forward the myth. It's never using evidence. But what's interesting to me here is that Rose's referencing of Nida, Wils, and Moulin to support her reading of the birth of translation studies reveals a specific mapping of the West, right? The US, Nida, Germany, Wils, and France, Moulin, which unintentionally perhaps indexes what Mignolo calls a geopolitics of knowledge. insofar as, and I'm quoting Mignolo here, maybe I have him, yes, insofar as, quote, German, English, and French are the three languages of modernity and imperial expansion since the 18th century that Emanuel Wallerstein associated with the emergence of the social sciences. And after having qualified her history as subjective and idiosyncratic, Rose nevertheless references other authoritative scholars, again, invoking the mythic logic by which repetition begets value. This mapping of the field, namely English, French, and German, with English in the lead, has changed very little since then if we look at the major Anglophone anthologies of translation studies. Andrew Chesterman's 1989 Readings in Translation Theory and the 2000, 2004, and 2012 editions of Lawrence Venuti's Translation Studies Reader. Of the 16 texts in Chesterman's anthology, 11 texts are written in English, 4 translated from German, and 1 translated from French. So English represents 69%, and translated texts from only German and French represent 31%. The 3 editions of Venuti's Reader offer a surprisingly similar and static picture. Out of 30 texts in the 2000 edition, 22 are written in English, and 8 or 27% are translations. 3 from French, 3 from German, now 2 from Spanish, and that's it. 27% of the texts are translations. Out of the 32 texts in the 2004 edition, 19 are written in English, and 13 or 41% are translations. Now, 6 from German, 5 from French, 1 from Latin, and 1 from Spanish. So in fact, the number of Spanish texts falls by 1, and you get an actual reconsolidation of the German and French heritage with an addition of Latin. Out of the 31 texts in the 2012 edition, 20 are written in English, and 11 or 35% are translations. 5 from German, 4 from French, 1 from Latin, and 1 from Spanish. Ominously, the 2012 edition contains a section entitled 2000s and Beyond, so you know he has it periodized, and the final section now is 2000 and Beyond, which could not have existed in the previous editions, and this section does not contain a single translation. Now, these figures roughly correspond to what I found in my study of reviews of translated works published in the New York Times in 1900, 1950, and 2000. French and German remain by far the most popular source languages across the century, with Spanish a distant third. In fact, I was surprised throughout the whole century that you did not see a major shift in that. So this geopolitics of knowledge, despite all of our talk about multiculturalism, etc., has remained fairly static. And little appears to be changing in this regard. Yeah. Oh. Maybe I turned it off. So in Lawrence Venuti's 2017 collected volume, Teaching Translation, Programs, Courses, Pedagogy. Thanks. I was initially excited to see 2 non-Western scholars cited as theorists, right? So as Judy mentioned yesterday, yes, you may see them cited as data, but having them cited as theorists is still quite rare. Those 2 were the Chinese writer and translator Liu Xun and the Soviet translation theorist Andrei Fyodorov. A moment later, however, I was depressed that a mere 2 non-Western names would have made me so happy. Moreover, neither author is represented in our available anthologies. Liu Xun was cited by the article's author, Schaden to Gelden, from a collection of his writings, mostly on literature, not on translation. So I'm always curious, where do people find these things, right? How does knowledge circulate, especially when it's not in any of our anthologies? Tegelden was, in fact, her dissertation advisor was Lydia Liu. So I imagine that's how she was turned on to Liu Xun and his article on hard translation, which of course has many things in common with Nabokov's literal translation. It came before Nabokov's literal translation, but we don't cite Liu Xun, we cite Nabokov, right? So this is all about the geopolitics of knowledge. And also, the Andrei Fyodorov was cited from a French translation. How the author came upon that, I don't know, because none of Fyodorov's writings have yet been translated into English. Now, Naoki Sakai argues that Asian theorists sounds like an oxymoron because of the Western colonization of knowledge, right? It has made it unlikely that Asians will be cited as theorists as opposed to as data, right? So the politics of how theory travels, I think, is more relevant than ever. And again, belies a lot of our discourse on globalization and multiculturalism. All right, number 4. These histories are characterized by a classic historiographic fallacy, whereby, yes, here it is, whereby the historian in hindsight lends an air of inevitability or inexorable logic to the events of the past. And this is actually tied very closely to developmental thinking, right? We know already what the goal of all of this progress is supposed to be. As Gordon S. Woods explains, the plots, the coherence, and the significance of narratives are always retrospective. This recognition lies behind the contempt French social historians, the Annales school, have for the unique, unconnected events of traditional narrative history. And this was also explains Yuri Lotman's obsession with explosive moments in history where the conclusion is unpredictable. For a historian to emphasize one of these unique events and not another, writes Françoise Furet, he has to assume some connecting plot in the events, that they are going somewhere. He has given them an ideological meaning. Nowhere, perhaps, is that fallacy more evident than in the most comprehensive elaboration of the originary myth of translation studies, the one offered by Tymoshko. The section is filled with sweeping statements regarding cause and effect, and again, is relatively free of citations. In fact, there are only 2, which is surprising in a history. One is to an article by Jerry White on filmmaking in Irish, and another is to George Steiner's own History of Translation Studies. Again, not a primary source, but an iteration of another interpretive reading of the development of the field. Steiner posits hermeneutics as the endpoint of development in much the same way as Tymoshko posits postpositivism, Pym posits the escape from equivalence, and Venuti claims visibility. Moreover, Tymoshko's claim that certain lessons, specifically that the ideological construction of others during the war clearly demonstrated how perception, knowledge, and meaning were shaped and controlled by cultural context, were derived from this war and not from other factors, or for that matter, from earlier wars such as World War I, which I'll talk about in a minute, is again a dubious one. This kind of argumentation supports Stanley Fish's contention that, quote, every interpretation is doomed to success, because you will find what you need to support it. For one chooses a narrative's endpoint first, the ascendancy of positivism, it is easy to select from the historical record the evidence needed to support it, thus making that ascendancy appear inevitable. As when Tymoshko declares, quote, it is no accident that the interest in translation exploded in the post-war period, and that the main schools of thinking about translation that emerged initially after the war can be related directly to post-positivist intellectual interests that were also central to wartime. The use of mirroring in the following sentence further underscores the directness of the link. Quote, the perspectives on translation that surface during and immediately after the war are mirrored in the trajectory of translation studies in the last 50 years. What is striking here is her insistence on World War II as, quote, a huge gulf, when some of the evidence Tymoshko herself puts forward contradicts such a decisive periodization. Her mention of Soviet filmmakers from the 1930s, for example, and of propaganda, quote, honed to perfection during the 1930s and 40s in fascist and communist countries, disrupts this direct plotting of cause and effect. Moreover, it suggests that there were open lines of communication between the communist East and the capitalist West, and that was in fact not the case. So too do her claims related to intellectual life. She mentions Wittgenstein's Blue Books, which originated in the early 30s, and most of Sapir and Worf's work was also done in the 30s. All this underscores the importance of examining alternative histories of translation studies in order not simply to provincialize Europe by relativizing its master narratives and universalizing myths, but also in seeing that development as far from inevitable, to gain a clear understanding of the specific cluster of factors contributing to the emergence of serious and sustained thinking about translation and interpreting related phenomena. To the extent that all knowledge is gained from comparison, as the Italian philosopher Leon Battista Alberti states, I will present below one such alternative history, the origin of which can be traced to World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution. Right, a very different origin. And again, I am not suggesting as the true origin of translation studies, but that we can imagine alternatives, and in doing so allows us to look critically at these Western visions. So while James Holmes was arguably the first to articulate the Western originary myth of translation studies described above, he was also one of the first, or of only a few Western scholars, to acknowledge that there was a lot going on in other parts of the world to which Western scholars did not have access, largely because they didn't know those languages and that work had not been translated. Right, again, the importance of geopolitics of knowledge, as this knowledge was not being produced in the dominant languages of international scholarship, English, French, and German, and paradoxically, translation scholars had not done a great job at translating themselves, a sentiment reiterated several times by Mary Snell Hornby in the 1990s. In the early 1980s, after listening to a conference paper given by the Estonian scholar Petr Torap in Russian, Holmes commented, "There are a great many of us who are interested in problems of translation theory and translation studies who do not know Russian and who have a terribly frustrating feeling that there is a great deal going on that is inaccessible to us." More recently, and unfortunately showing that little has changed since the early 80s, Anthony Pym, with the help of a Russian-speaking graduate student, began to explore Russian translation theory, declaring quite ingenuously at the end of his article, could we really have ignored the Russians so completely? For a variety of reasons, not least among them Cold War politics and perhaps the enduring legacy of Western developmental models that produced Eastern Europe as underdeveloped and backwards, writing on translation from Eastern Europe from 1918 to 1989 remain understudied and largely untranslated. Not to mention writings on translation from the Global South, which until the publication of Martha Chung's Anthology of Chinese Discourse on Translation and Leo Ta-Kung Chan's 20th Century Chinese Translation Theory were largely unavailable to non-Chinese scholars. The importance, I can't stress how important it is to have theoretical works, and by theoretical I'm using that very broadly, but works that reflect on translation, to have those translated. Otherwise, these cultures will be only cited by area specialists or cited as data, not as theoreticians or theoretical writings themselves. Clearly, those scholars who advanced the narrative that translation studies was born in the West following the victory in the Second World War were blissfully ignorant that serious and systematic study of translation and interpreting related phenomena had begun in earnest and with enormous financial support from the Soviet government almost immediately following the Bolshevik Revolution. Right? This is a less feel-good story for the West to think that translation studies might have been born with the Bolshevik Revolution. As a multi-ethnic and multilingual polity at the vanguard of an internationalist movement, the Soviet government established already in 1918 the World Literature Publishing House, underscoring the central role of translation in pursuing its internationalist agenda, both at home and abroad, and the very lofty goal of creating cosmopolitan Soviet readers. In those very tumultuous years, marked by a lack of paper, among other things, a lack of almost everything, the publishing house set itself extremely ambitious goals. In his report to the government publishing agency, the director of world literature stated, in the first 2 years, the publishing house worked on a grand scale. 350 translators and editors, yearly up to 2,500 to 3,000 printing sheets were accepted. Such an impressive enterprise was necessary on the one hand because it had to fulfill its obligations to the People's Commissariat of Education. According to the agreement, 300 volumes had to be published every year. On the other hand, the Soviet state wanted to help the writers with financial difficulties by providing them with translation work. The second reason, the purely philanthropic goal, was a corollary of the special function of the publishing house in the political life of the country. The founders of the VL project intended to be a link between the Soviet authorities and the literary intelligentsia. That government-sponsored initiative soon led to a number of publications. Principles of Artistic Translation in 1919 by Karnichukowski Lev Gubilyov, an expanded version in 1920, The Theory and Practice of Translation in Ukrainian by Alexander Finkel in 1929, Art of Translation, co-authored by Karnichukowski and Andrei Fyodorov in 1930, The Problem of Artistic Translation in 1931 by Mikhail Alexeyev, The Art of Translation by Karnichukowski in 1936, Introduction to Artistic Translation by Andrei Fyodorov, and A High Art by Karnichukowski in 1943. So all before Russia's entry into the Second World War. And again, this is not including the countless articles that had come out dedicated to translation studies. And as early as the 1920s, the Soviets were writing about simultaneous interpreting, and as early as the 1930s about machine translation. An entry on translation appeared in the Soviet Literary Encyclopedia already in 1934. But there was also, I mean, again, how do we claim that a discipline has been born? I would also argue that there was consciousness that they were creating what in Russian they called a nauka, which could be translated, a field of science, a discipline, if you will, right? So in the publisher's introduction to the 1919 Principles of Literary Translation, they wrote, "We are issuing this pamphlet in the hope that the efforts of its authors will be continued, and that in the near future, through consolidated efforts, we shall succeed perhaps in laying the foundations, if not of a nauka, a science or discipline, then at least of a practical guide." Right? So that already in their minds, this might be the start of a discipline. And this gets repeated later. They stress the urgent need for the theoretical elaboration of the problems of literary translation, right? Coming from a Marxist perspective, the need for theory was at the front of their imagination, and for a theoretical basis for the practice of literary translation. In Chukovsky's own introduction, he writes, "The art of translation is slowly becoming a science or discipline, again a nauka, while remaining at the same time an art. And now when the practice of the art of translation has reached such a height, it is at last time to create, on the basis of this unprecedented practice, a theory." Right? And he claims then that his 1919 principles had been just such an attempt. Right? Again, it's irrelevant if this is enough to claim it as a theory. There's no litmus test for that. But again, I can say that the Soviets were conscious that they may be producing a nauka. And in fact, in the 1920s, a scholarly study of translation was initiated and conducted within two central cultural organizations, the State Academy for Artistic Sciences and the State Institute for the History of Art. They produced a brief report that offered a conceptual mapping of the field, not unlike, a little more crude, but not unlike Holmes's mapping. Right. And this is from this report, produced in the late 20s. Translation is an art and has its own means of representation. To study the devices and limits of this art is the task of this subcommittee. We must by necessity limit ourselves to material related to Russia, translation into Russia or out of Russian. We would like to study Russian translation in its theoretical and historical dimensions. In the realm of theory, we are interested in the general principles forming the basis of translation, the acquisition by the Russian language of metrics suitable to foreign forms, that is, the enrichment of Russian literary forms. Again, very positive terms, the enrichment of Russian forms through translation, the relationship between the Russian language and other languages, and the difficulties that arise in translation. 2, in the historical realm, we are significantly interested in Russian translations of the 19th and early 20th centuries, but not exclusively. All right, but now I want us, so it's not important to me that there was perhaps another tradition, but what is interesting is that this was a tradition that was born not under the shadow of machine translation. So this was a tradition born with no discussion of equivalence. They were not conflicted about that. So I want to share with you this beautiful opening paragraph of Chukovsky's 1919 Principles of Artistic Translation. The translator of literary prose does not photograph the original, but artistically recreates it. In order to be a translator, it is not sufficient to know this or that foreign language. The translator is an artist, a master of the word, a co-participant in the creative work of that author whom he is translating. He is the same kind of servant of art as an actor, sculptor, or painter. The text of the original serves as the material for his complex and often inspired creation. The translator is, first of all, a talent. Again, sounds very contemporary to us with this notion of translation as writing, as a creative process, etc. Right? Utterly freed already from the shackles of equivalence, right? So they didn't have to go through this process of freedom. They weren't born, my theory is that they weren't born under the shadow of machine translation. And he goes on, in my opinion, this was very interesting. So they decide to name it Principles of Artistic Translation, although the co-author had wanted rules. And Chukovsky balked, and he said, in my opinion, there are no such rules. What rules are there in literature when one translator creates and it turns out perfectly, while another transfers the rhythm and everything, but it doesn't move, right? So is it alive or not? Right? They're not dividing it up to, oh, you missed this and you got this wrong. It's does the thing come to life? Very different perspective on it. And in fact, I would claim that this is not an outlier. This idea of translations as being alive, of language. Now, we talked the other day about how your understanding of translation reveals your deeper understanding of language and how language works. And so Russians are very interested in language as a living thing. But then look at the two epigraphs Chukovsky chooses for this principles of translation. This by Lamartine, de tous les livres à faire, le plus difficile à mon avis, c'est une traduction. And the other one, nor ought a genius less his worth attempt translation. So a genius. And in fact, long ago, Pushkin in the early 19th century declared Chukovsky to be a genius of translation. So we're not used to, in our tradition, associating translation with genius, right? It's usually original genius. And what's also inspiring is that, well, let me talk a little bit about this notion of language being alive. Of course, Bakhtin is famous for talking about the living life of language. Chukovsky himself wrote a book about the Russian language called Zhivoy как жизнь, as alive as life. And Nora Gal's famous work, she was an editor and a translator, famous work on translations is called The Word, Living and Dead, right? So there is a holistic type of understanding of translation quality, right? That doesn't think about cutting up into pieces. And in fact, you may remember the other day I read that quote from Andrei Fyodorov who said, oh, it's very easy to prove untranslatability if you cut the text into pieces and then show, oh, this doesn't align with this. But if you take a holistic version, it's much more difficult to do. And in fact, most recently we see this trope in Irina Kalashnikov's 2008 volume, "Po-Ruski s любовью," in Russian with love, conversations with Russian translators, right? So again, they're not afraid of maybe, as Piotr was saying, the people aspect of it, right? Chukovsky's core belief in translation as a highly creative act is set forward in the beginning of the principles in the 2 epigraphs he selects, and this emphasis on creativity and on a holistic approach to translation quality lived on in Soviet translation theory, as I showed by the example from Fyodorov. Moreover, this conceptualization offers a rather different way to conceive of the translator's invisibility. Chapter 1 of Chukovsky's Art of Translation, 1930 Art of Translation, co-authored with Andrei Fyodorov, is titled Лицо переводчика, the face of the translator, right? Granting, with face being etymologically linked to the word личность, which is a creative personality, right? So granting the translator a face, whereas in Western culture, he is often viewed as faceless. What is also striking about early Soviet translation theory is its optimism and what distinguishes it from early Western theory of the post-war period. And so for those translators and lovers of translation who are depressed by the rhetoric of loss and distortion that continues to characterize popular translation criticism in the West, a legacy, I think, of Romanticism with its cult of original genius, just take a look at Soviet rhetoric for something completely different. Of course, those are the print runs, which were enormous of translated works. Translation in Soviet literature stands at an extraordinarily high level and fulfills tasks that are extraordinarily responsible. This is why analysis of examples from the work of Soviet translators and the exploration of the problems that lie before them in particular are of interest both for Soviet literature and for world literature. This is only natural, as Soviet literature is international. Now, I'm going to wrap this up by saying there are many reasons for this triumphant tone. On the one hand, original writing was viewed with increasing suspicion by the Soviet regime, making translation, like bardic authorship, into a less dangerous alternative to romantic authorship. On the other hand, the regime recognized translation to be essential in fostering mutual understanding or solidarity among peoples, both within the multilingual, multi-ethnic Soviet Union and outside it. In other words, by promoting translation, the regime enhanced its reputation as the capital of the international communist movement. And while in the US, translations, as people conjecture, make up only 3% of all published works, the Soviets published a great number of foreign works, often in huge print runs. I mean, really, the statistics are staggering. And this is from an article, from a speech by Alexander Fadeev entitled On the Cause of World Peace. So this idea that translating was promoting world peace. But I won't read through all of these, but just look at the statistics here for translations. According to the data from the All-Union Book Chamber from 1917 to 1948, that is from the entire existence of the new Russia, the works of 206 American authors, I am speaking here only of literature, were translated into Russian and other languages of the Soviet Union. Overall, 2,245 works of American literature were published in a general circulation of 39,709,000. And as you see for the individual authors, 11,164,000, Upton Sinclair in a print run of 2 million, etc. So I mean, just staggering statistics when we compare those to the US. All right. So again, I don't want to suggest that this is the true history, but it's so nice to have alternatives because then we can start to, again, provincialize, see what's particular about ours, see that this obsession with equivalence is not a necessary stage through which any field of translation would have to pass, right? And so let me... All right, so to conclude, why deconstruct this originary myth of translation studies? So I present this other history of translation studies not to give it preeminence as the true history of the field. Again, I don't want to recreate a tree paradigm, but to suggest rather a rhizomatic understanding of translation studies. But also because it helps to expose the global design behind the Western originary myth, and to contribute to the ongoing project of provincializing Europe, which may paradoxically offer new insights into the development of translation theory in the West itself, right? It will give us a more sophisticated understanding of our own Western translation theory. So again, as Alberti states, if all knowledge proceeds from comparison, then the ability to compare alternative translation studies traditions holds the promise of greater understanding of the particularities of translation studies as it evolved in all parts of the world, but specifically in the West with its obsession with its equivalence and loss. Like with students' alternative conceptions, I believe it is important for us to dismantle or unlearn this powerful originary myth before we are able to truly enlarge and transnationalize translation studies and affect this entrenched geopolitics of knowledge. Without doing so, I'm afraid any attempt at enlarging the field can only end up an expansion. I'll end there.